All right, can you hear me? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ali Reza Kabirian. I'm an associate professor of supply chain management at Marshall School of Business. I work very closely with Dr. Nick Wyas. And first of all, thank you so much for staying with us this afternoon. I see a lot of familiar faces here from my former students especially, and some new students who are going to be taking some of my classes, I guess, starting next week. I hope that you stay awake. If you've taken some of my 8 a.m. classes before, so this is not going to be as bad, I would say. And so, yes, our topic is about supply chain risk. What are the different ways that supply chains can actually be exposed to vulnerabilities? And you can actually, of course, define supply chain risk a lot of different ways, a lot of different factors that can influence risk. So on one side, you've got suppliers that can disrupt your supply chains. If you're not doing a good job in trying to vet your suppliers, you work with the wrong partner. They might not exist in some cases. They may not be able to deliver the right product, the right quality, the right time. So all sorts of vulnerabilities. So how can you vet your suppliers properly when you are selecting your suppliers? And also once you select them, how do you maintain the relationship so that you don't get disrupted? And then moving on, you've got other parts of the supply chain, obviously, that can also fail. Could be about facilities of different types, could be about fulfillment centers, could be about ports, different transportation modes, shipping lanes that can get disrupted. Disruption could happen in the marketplace, obviously, so you do not do a good job of forecasting demand, so you plan on the wrong things. You design strategies or design structures for the supply chains that are based on wrong forecasts, and now that exposes you to risk. There might be technology change. There might be preferences of the consumers that change over time. So all of these are exposures that you have to be aware of. And sometimes we have outside factors as well, especially over the past 6-7 months of the new administration. Obviously, we've got a lot of exogenous factors like macroeconomic factors, geopolitical risks that supply chains are exposed to. Sometimes the strategies that we adopt in the supply chain are exposing us to risk. So today's panel is about that. If we're trying to talk about some of these risky factors, talk about some of the symptoms, how we can actually identify those, how we can actually deal with those, how we can actually mitigate those. And our panelists are going to be sharing some of their experiences with you here. So what we're going to do first is that I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to get to questions and ask the panelists to share their experiences with us. So I would like to ask everybody to please tell us your name, which company you're coming from, and maybe your story, and then we'll get going. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Klaus. I'm with Dun & Bradstreet, based out of New York City. It's a real honor to be here today with this brilliant panel I've gotten to know over the last couple of days. Looking forward to discussing the financial risk of the supply chain. It's evolving. Again, with this brilliant panel, I kind of feel like the Fredo Corleone of the group, but that's okay. So looking forward to a great discussion.
Hello, everyone. Alvin Moreno. I'm with Nestle, but I'm also a Trojan, Cohort 1 Global Masters Program here. Excited to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yassine Alvarez. I'm manager of partnerships and trade data for CreditSafe USA. CreditSafe is a global business information provider.
Hello, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Venkat Raman. I'm a principal at Vertex Computer Systems. I'm based in Boston. The company is headquartered in Ohio, and what we do is we help organizations through systems, services, platforms, solve problems with supply chain logistics and so on. I was here about 10 years ago, and congratulations to Nick Vyas and his team to take the event to this where it is today. So happy to be here sitting with this esteemed panel, and special thanks to Alireza and Alvin, and look forward to a great session. And I promise I'll keep my sound as interesting as Wink so that you won't fall asleep.
That's a hard one to follow. Mike Flum, I'm the CEO and president of Credit Risk Monitor. Similarly, we're information service providers for financial risk and bankruptcy analytics. So, Alvin, thanks for the invite and the nudge. Ali Reza, it's been a pleasure. And the rest of you guys, looking forward to a panel.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. So, yeah, so we're going to start, I guess, with the operating stream of the supply chain about supplier selection. So, in fact, that's the core expertise that our panelists have. That it was about financial data that could be used to try to find out if any supplier is at risk, potentially risk of disruption, perhaps. So my first question is actually for Mike. What are the early financial signals that you monitor and track to tell whether a supplier is about to get disrupted?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the first thing I would say is it's actually about the monitoring, because what we've seen in supply chain is a lot of this is really a sourcing function without then the continuation of review. So I personally always advise clients to take a look at kind of maybe 5 or 6 different categories. First one being liquidity. So looking at things like cash, quick, and current. They're all going to tell you different things about where that working capital is coming from for a business, and kind of how able they're, how they're able to deal with disruption and deal with issues. I like to look at operating cash flow. I know as you start to graduate from startup into scaled business, people stop operating off the cash flow statement, but that's where the bread and butter is. Net burn rates are really important. I also like to look at profitability for gross margins, and net margins just tells you about what's going on with the business. Probably leverage is one that I pay a lot more attention to, especially of late. With interest rates going up, that can really be the harbinger of doom for a supply chain. So looking at debt to asset ratios, interest coverage ratios. One of my favorite ones that people don't look at recently is actually short-term debt as a percentage of total. I know Cov Light has kind of taken over the entire world, but it used to be a thing where you violated a covenant, all of a sudden you went current. That's a huge spike, sign of risk. One other one I would just hold out for private companies, because I know many more private companies than publics where it's sometimes hard to get financial statements, but we all also specialize in trade payments. So looking at how AR is being paid down by customers. So in some ways for supply chain, it's almost like how well is your tier 1 paying your tier 2? Makes sense.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to bring Brian to this discussion as well. So is there any data that you would use to try to proactively tell whether a supplier is fragile?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that I think the whole the process of evaluating supplier risk I wouldn't even call it evolving. I would say it's transforming, right? So the way that our customers are looking at their supplier base has changed radically, really in the last 4 years. And I'll give you a quick example. About 4 or 5 years ago, we were speaking with one of the largest private equity firms in the world, and you wouldn't necessarily think of them as monitoring their suppliers, right? But they came to us and they wanted to say, all right, how are we going to look at it differently? Are we going to look at just the traditional way of looking at a snapshot of our suppliers, and we're able to tell you what their risk is based on predictive indicators that we all have? But they said, okay, that's great, but we need to take a deeper dive, because it's going to really depend on if we are going to take a stake or a position in this company, or their current portfolio companies. They wanted their list of suppliers, how they were performing financially. So what we did is we wanted to take a deeper dive. So we went back and we looked, going back about 20 years. And the aha moment for us was, the words that they used to us were, we want to see how this company is performing from birth to death. Now, for some companies, obviously we can't go back that far, but let's say for the last 20 years. So what we did was we went back through an archive database and we looked at, how did this company perform coming out of, let's say, the dot-com bubble? How did they perform going through, obviously, 2008 and 2009? How did they perform coming out of that? And then COVID. And what it also allowed our customers to do, and it's the same with other data providers, is you can overlay different geopolitical, natural disasters, any sort of change in economic conditions in the country, and say, okay, how were they performing? How are they going to be able to perform for us? How reliable will they be? Because at that point, they've gone through every single possible economic cycle. And one of the things we've talked about over the past couple of days is economic cycles are changing pretty quickly now, whether it's the threat of tariffs, whether it's sanctions, whether it's, geopolitical landscapes that are changing. So really, that's the way it's really transforming, and it allows our customers and everyone's customers to really bulletproof as best you can your supplier base from financial pitfalls. So
Thank you for that. And one of these customers has been Alvin, so I want your take on this as well. How do you use this data to detect signs for trouble, and what do you do with that if a supplier is in its distress?
So, the first thing that we do is obviously rely on these people here. It's a big universe out there. I have an internal team that analyzes risk, they analyze the ratios, they analyze everything. I look at the crowd here and your supply chain professionals. Not everyone is really comfortable with what's a balance sheet, what's a P&L, what's a cash flow, right? What are the ratios? There's a number of different ratios, right? But even someone like me that has 40 years experience in finance and half of my life experience in supply chain risk, I still depend on these folks because I find myself dealing with different countries and they have different accounting standards. Their balance sheets are structured differently. So they have armies of analysts behind them, and I rely on them for clarity and understanding of risk and what's going on. The other thing that we rely on them is the monitoring. Like I said, one of the challenges we have is we look at a vendor. We don't just look at the financial composition. We look at the geopolitical, the volatility in commodities, currencies, anything that could impact them that could result to a disruption to our production, right? But just because we looked at a vendor today, well, we're not going to look at it for another 18 months, 24 months. And when we have thousands of vendors that are critical, that could actually stop our production, we don't have enough eyes internally to look at everything. So that's where we leverage these folks, because they know when an earthquake happens, a tsunami happens, it impacted production of one of our suppliers, or even more important, a supplier of one of our suppliers. We've had instances where a supplier of a supplier, a customer of one of our suppliers failed and it threw them out of business. And now we're held with a disruption. So that's pretty much how we digest the information we get from the panel here that's being represented.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. So yeah, definitely financial fragility is important, and that underscores the need for transparency. So obviously companies need to know their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 even sometimes and beyond suppliers. So my next question is actually for Yassine. So what are the best practices to identify risky suppliers potentially, and what do you do for risk profiling your potential suppliers when you're selecting one?
So, it's interesting when we talk about risk. Risk is such a big word, right? And it's such a vague word. And you, as supply chain professionals, you have your hands in the vendor onboarding, the logistics, the transportation, raw materials sourcing. There are so many diverse aspects. And risk has all that diversity associated with it as well. So from a best practices standpoint, if we start with something really basic and fundamental, and we were talking about this when we all got together for lunch yesterday, managing your master data. And it sounds so boring and kind of unsexy to make sure that you know what the actual legal name of the company you're contracting with, that you know that the address that they put on the contract or the purchase order is the actual correct address. And we heard, I think, in a presentation yesterday when they were talking about, bad data going in and bad data going out. If you start with that premise that part of your, best practice in onboarding a potential new partner or supplier or vendor is to establish the rules of really understanding who you're working with. And then that would lead you to second step in terms of analyzing compliance risk, the reputational risk to your organization. So having access to information that tells you is the partner or vendor or supplier that you're interacting with, have they had negative press related to child labor laws or, bribery scandal in their country? All of those things reflect poorly on you. And then finally, what we've all talked about here, having at least a baseline understanding of financial risk. If you're signing a contract for more than 1 year, is that vendor or supplier going to be around for year 2 and year 3? So I would say those probably the top 3.
Thank you. You want to
If
take?
I can add a real example of what she's saying.
I love when you do that.
All right. I got I got a number of horror stories, but the most recent one, I got a call from procurement, and they're telling me, hey, we paid this vendor for these machines that they're supposed to install in our line, and we pay up to 90% of the value of the machine ahead of time before it's installed, right? And they give me the name of the vendor. It's like, well, you never asked us to vet the vendor, so of course no one has a record of DMB, credit safe experience, no one, right? So I asked them for the address, exact contract. So I go into, Google Maps, and it's like it's a shack in the middle of a forest. Really? Non-existent, non-registered, no record of a company with any of the Secretary of States in the U.S., nothing. So that's the importance of, we fronted all this money and we got no value for it. And that's just the most recent one. I've seen them as high as $27 million in a loss at one time because we had an issue with a vendor. So it's really important to vet your vendors and stay on top of them.
And I would say, just to piggyback on what Yassine brought up, it's a great point yesterday when we were talking, and again today, is when you're talking about reputational risk, right? I mean, you don't think sometimes that downstream effects will have such an impact on your reputation based on what your supply chain is. We had a situation with a pretty large Asian conglomerate where they got fined $118 million because one of their secondary suppliers out of 35,000 suppliers was somehow connected to a terrorist organization. They had no idea, right? I mean, they were in the news to the point where after the second violation, the second OFAC violation they got, Tokyo was basically going to pull them out of New York and pull them walk away from a $60 billion operation because the reputational risk was so bad, right? And it was so damaging. So the financial risk has this downstream effect sometimes into reputational. I mean, we all remember HSBC years ago had a $2 billion fine, I think it was. So that has a real impact on the bottom line of the company and the supply chain.
Venkat, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Sure. We talked about financial risk, reputational risk, and so on. Before I go there, to answer your question, I have to share with you, I have a 5-phase career. Started with supply chain, materials management, switched careers to sales, IT management, and finally as IT service provider, now looking from this side to solve problems for people like Alvin in Nestle. So I have personal experience. So the answer to the question is yes. If you look at your supply chain, you think you have the most robust supply chain until it's not. And then you peel the onion, you see that your supplier tier 2 and tier 3 is where the issue is. And if you look at general statistics, ChatGPT perhaps, it'll say that 70% of supply chain disruptions come from tier 2 and tier 3. So can organizations do something about it? Yes, by contractual transparency, making sure audits, monitors, and things like that are done. Sorry. And that way you can minimize the risk. So let me jump to my personal experience way back when I thought I would put the best supply chain, tier 1, for a contract electronics manufacturer. And everything was humming along perfectly until for a small part from a tier 2 supplier didn't show up and the entire assembly line came to a halt. And I, as a supply chain owner, had to get involved and find an alternate supplier, get the item shipped through air shipment, and get the assembly line back functioning. So that's the real cost. Now, what did I learn from that? The root cause was, okay, build transparency and build your second-tier supply chain. This was in the days with Excel and so on, not the digital world. But still, even after implementing it, what is missing was you don't know if the tier 2 supply chain has a real problem with the deliveries or not. So you're still under risk even with that put together. Now, let me switch context to more recently for a customer. The customer has 2 models. It's a large customer. They manufacture themselves And they also manufacture through contract manufacturers. And with the contract manufacturers, they provide all the raw materials needed. So the solution that we put together provided visibility into everything for the for the customer and for the contract supplier. So what that gave the customer the unique advantage is they can see where the gaps are and move all the ingredients necessary to get the supply chain going in real time between contract manufacturer and themselves. So that's one way of mitigating the risk.
You want to take?
Yeah, do you mind if I say one thing? I think that's a really great point. And I think one thing that often gets left behind within tier 1 and tier 2 mapping or tier N mapping is there's actually concentration effects within the nodes themselves, right? Because a tier 2 to you could also be a tier 1 to one of your tier 1s, right? And so there's a lot of redundancy within these nodes where you actually can get concentration effects that are oftentimes not found unless you can pursue things like digital twin technologies. So, that's one of the big benefits on us. And I just want to say one other thing from our experience in dealing with supply chain. A lot of the focus tends to be on things like quality fade or, logistical, issues in terms of getting delivery. But financial risk and what we're talking about can often be like kind of the canary in the coal mine, because basically when you start to get into distress, you start to cut back on anything that's not bolted to the ground, right? So you're not going to see things like quality, being paid for. You're not going to see things like R&D being invested in. You lose innovation. You may not find yourself actually making the right CapEx investments to do maintenance. And so you end up in these situations that just create much larger fragilities within your supply chain, right? So just things to keep in mind. It may not be the top of mind for your own KPIs, but at the end of the day, it can be one of those things that gives you insights into when those KPIs may start to be affected.
Thank you. So yeah, sometimes decisions are made outside our basically supply chains and our businesses that still influence our supply chains and expose us to risk. I'm talking about exogenous factors like macroeconomic factors, geopolitical risks that supply chains are exposed to. So next question is maybe for Mike. What are the macroeconomic factors or maybe policy disruptions that you would recommend companies to follow?
It's a great question, and I wish I had a really good answer for you guys. I think there's a lot of factors to track on this, and obviously, tariffs has been one of the things that people tend to be focused on. When we were talking about this yesterday, one of the items is having scenario plans and kind of contingencies figured out for any sort of thing that you consider as a big risk. So from a geopolitical thing, I would say you probably also need to understand who your alternative suppliers might be in any particular event. So knowing where they're located gives you obviously access to interesting information around the macroeconomics. Things that we like to focus on that for different regions is access to skilled labor. One of the examples that gets used a lot is China +1 with Vietnamese, access. But there's limits to Vietnamese skilled labor, for instance, in semiconductors now. Samsung has snapped up most of that capacity. So you may think you have a supplier that's viable over there, but everyone is chasing that exact same capacity at the exact same time. So it's everyone running through a small window that's closing. So you may have a scenario. Are you willing to go ahead and possibly take a margin cut to keep that line open? I don't know. That depends on your own management team. And I think that's one of those things that's changed a little bit with the pandemic is the idea of globalization, just-in-time inventory, all of those things certainly got stressed to a point where you can see the downside risk to market share, right? One of the examples, and actually Venkat kind of mentioned it, but I love the one with Ford. They had, I don't know, several thousand F-150s just sitting on that plant waiting for a temperature chip that's a Gen 1 PD probe, right? Basically costs like cents on the dollar to get. And yet you have a paperweight sitting in all of your plants with idle staff and you can't monetize simply because you can't get one little piece. That used to be something no one ever thought about, was clearly never considered to be a critical inventory component. And yet with a changing macro environment and disruption of shipping, all of a sudden that becomes the little piece that stops you from being able to make $35,000 a unit. Kind of crazy.
Brian, do you have any take on this? What are the macroeconomic factors that you recommend?
Yeah, I think kind of to Mike's point, it's kind of difficult as most everybody knows to kind of pinpoint what signals from a macro perspective to look for. But it's there's certain obvious ones, right? I mean, if you're an oil company and you're one of your biggest suppliers is in Venezuela, well, you know, a coup is kind of a pretty big signal that maybe I should be looking somewhere else. But again, it's those geopolitical landscape, and I think, you know, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, the way everything is changing so rapidly in the country and around the world. You know, there's the threat of tariffs, and then there's a 90-day delay. You know, there's whether it's an OPEC meeting coming up, if they're going to cut production, if they're going to increase production, if there's an FOMC meeting with that they're going to be cutting rates. All of these signals, whether they be geopolitical or truly economic signals, sometimes it's kind of hard to pin down. But, you know, I think it's more based on the industry that you're in, right? And I think that's the best way to look at it. And they're all available to all of us, right? But yeah, I just think it's more of kind of a snapshot of everything, really, kind of like what Mike was saying. I mean, it's really hard to, you know, it's such a broad thing to think about, but, you know, every little thing, like I just mentioned, really has an impact on your supply chain, you know?
Thank you so much. So, Venkat, do you want to chime on this? So
Sure.
you've got a lot of experience on this.
Sure. Yeah, Mike and Brian, great points. For me, I look at it as, do you have control over the events? Probably not. Do you have control over how you respond? I think yes. So I'll cite an example of customer we work with, fairly large customer again, hundreds of thousands of parts shipped across the globe from plants, finished goods, semi-finished goods. You have to classify them so that they go through customs and do all the protocols fairly straightforward. And the solution they had in place was fairly rudimentary, very manual, intense, time-intensive and labor-intensive. And we got involved and we came up with an AI machine learning-based approach to solving that. And that with constant training, maybe once in 3 months training from subject matter experts, the model became fine-tuned to the extent that you could introduce a new component, new variation, and have that be classified very quickly with 99% accuracy. Now, in January, until January, we didn't expect this tariff-related challenges. Now that it's here, suddenly we are saying, we are in discussions with the customer saying, here's an opportunity. We built a great solution. Can we now look at it differently? Can we use the same tool to respond to this policy direction about tariffs? Because it's not getting rolled out in one go. I mean, you have one way of doing it today, and then it changes tomorrow. So how do you adapt? So here's an example of within organizations, instead of saying, how do we respond? Look inside. Perhaps there's something out there that you can repurpose and be creative and respond to it.
Thank you. Yeah, as a supply chain professor, I can tell you that, of course, I have to stay relevant with what's going on in politics and geopolitics and any kind of policy shift that might impact supply chains. I would say up until the end of last year, I didn't have to watch the news so often. But right now, you have to watch and hear the news like every single hour that you might be missing something important. And right now, I might be missing something that is going on in Alaska between President Putin and, let's say, President Trump that might impact supply chain. So staying relevant is very important. So I guess our last topic that I would like to cover here is about
just as a show of hands, is anybody like watching Truth Social right now just to figure out what's going on with the tariffs? Because quite honestly, like, that's actually one of the feeds that people use right now, is getting Twitter feeds and getting Truth Social feeds as a way of ingesting this stuff and pushing it. So I know a lot of people have done homegrown systems on APIs with that, but that is a great source, right? I hate to say that that's actually where news is coming from now, but.
All right, so our last topic is about strategies that we adopt in supply chains and the structures that we build in supply chains. And sometimes we adopt the strategies that expose us to additional risk. An example could be that we build supply chains that are efficient. We try to basically cut on inventories, implement just in time. And suddenly something like COVID happens and we don't have any inventories to tap into. We don't have any extra capacities sitting around to try to tap into to ramp up production overnight, and that exposes to us to risk. So how do we balance basically the benefits that we gain from efficiencies of just-in-time versus opportunities that we might potentially miss? So there are a lot of these structural problems that we create in supply chains and expose us to risk. So one of them is actually about consolidation of suppliers, that nowadays we are working with suppliers that are bigger. Small suppliers may not survive necessarily. So I want to ask actually Alvin, because I know that he has experience in this area. So what are the risks associated with supplier consolidations that need to be monitored and managed?
Yeah, so for the last, 20 years, I've seen consolidation, in supply chain, in the number of suppliers, because, you get more competitive pricing that way, right? The bigger your contract, the better pricing you can get. The danger with that is if you're dealing with 100 suppliers, one fails, 99 that are left can cover it, no problem. But if you're down to 10 and one fails, you're going to find out that maybe the remaining 9 don't have the capacity to fill that void. So there's always that competing, issue. Yesterday, one of the first panels talked about too much inventory is bad, not enough inventory is bad, and you have to strike that balance, right? And you always have these competing measures. You have the P&L and you have the balance sheet, right? You don't have the inventory, you can't fill your sales, you impact the bottom line. You have too much inventory, well, your working capital costs are too high, right? But then one of the things that we saw when COVID started, we were running, or most companies were running above 90% utilization of their lines. All of a sudden, demand boomed and there was no capacity. We had to go outside to look for capacity, and everyone was competing on that capacity. One of the things we found is that when we talk about just-in-time, running at 95+% utilization on your lines, you don't have the elasticity to change with a sudden change in the environment. So at what point do you balance that with stakeholders? Hey, there's a cost, right? But there's a cost to elasticity, but it's going to impact the bottom line. So yeah, I mean, what I'll tell you is I'm more careful on looking at my suppliers, because I know that if I have a breakdown, it could be a catastrophic breakdown. It's not going to be a small breakdown. And not all your suppliers, just your critical ones. Right? Think about the suppliers that could impact your supply chain, right? Think about especially the ones that you sole source and single source, that you don't have an option. And you could say, well, I'll call another supplier. Well, yeah, you got to vet them. Quality, compliance, safety, sustainability, right? Sanctions. You got to make sure that they vet through that process, and it could take months. And in the meantime, you're not producing. That's your immediate hit. Long-term hit is loss of market share, loss of customers, right? So that's the way I look at it.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, I actually want to go back to Venkat on this. So one of the questions is, how can I tell if my strategies or the structure of my supply chain is vulnerable to risk? Is there any way to tell that? I might have adopted efficiency, I might have adopted responsiveness for my supply chain, I might have opened up new facilities. How can I tell if I'm exposed to some risk?
Yeah, great question. And Alvin, great points that I hope we are helping you in some ways in answering those questions.
Yeah, you need to understand your supply chain. Where's your concentration? What are your sole source points, single source points? And do you have alternative, what we call a BCP, business continuation plan? It could be as simple as having another vetted vendor. I've had situations where I know a vendor is going to go under. We know they're not going to survive more than 6 months. I call out to the factory and they said, well, I have another vetted vendor. It's 200 kilometers away. This one happens to be like 2 blocks away, right? I'm going to basically use the supplier until the wheels fall off. But, my response was, how long would it take you to get, product from the other supplier? 2 weeks. So build a 2-week, inventory, safety net, right? See what that's going to cost. And if that is more than the savings you have using that other supplier, then you're good. If not, just switch now. But it's understanding your risk, understanding your environment, because Someone said yesterday, don't wait for the problem to find you. Find out where those potential problems can come from and be prepared for them. That's it. That's the key to making sure that you don't have a disruption.
I would also
Dr.
say
Noble
that
said that, yeah.
along those same lines is paying attention to certain commodities, right? I mean, like we talk about cocoa and coffee, which is such a huge part of what Nestle has, is where are there risks within certain countries, certain regions that might have an impact on, you know, coffee, cocoa, and I'm only using that as an example because my buddy from Nestle is here. But you know, you pay attention to those. We were talking earlier about signals, right? And like if there is any sort of geopolitical unrest in Colombia, you know, that obviously has a huge impact on the coffee industry, or in Africa. We were talking about that yesterday. So I think really from a macro perspective, if you look at it that way, it can really help, you know, identify where the risk is.
You know, you bring a really interesting point because, again,
Thank
it's
you.
a big universe. I mentioned that earlier. I got suppliers all over the world, and I don't see everything every day all the time, but we get updates. We get red flags. It could be from DNB, from CreditSafe, from Credit Risk Monitor. It could be from Experian. It could be from Bloomberg alerting me, hey, by the way, these vendors in this market or in this industry are impacted, and it makes my analysts look and make sure that there's no problem. And we're proactively looking at it rather than getting a call from procurement, hey, I have a problem, and we didn't catch it. So again, it's your monitoring and your tools and your support that you have there. You know, again, you know, if you don't have the reliable network there, you know, you're going to struggle.
Go ahead.
So thank you. Can I ask, is anyone from Tokyo here? Japan? Anyone? Well, there's one person. Okay, great. So I used to live and work in Japan, and one of the things I experienced that was beautiful was their insistence on having periodic earthquake drills. And in the beginning, I said it doesn't make sense because I was not used to it. But then one time when I was in the office, it really happened. An earthquake happened, and the building started swaying. And believe it or not, all the 23 floors evacuated with no panic, and everyone was safe. And I said, this is remarkable. So if you have good processes, good discipline, and if you practice, things are possible. Now, going back to supply chain, is it possible to introduce noise or shock into your system and simulate whether your supply chain tier 1 is performing as well as you want when things happen, or tier 2 and tier 3? I don't know if we are quite there yet, because a lot of organizations are still digitizing their processes, data, like she was saying, is not fully there, you know, garbage in, garbage out. So, but I think we're making a lot of strides. So the answer is yes, it's possible. We're getting there. And I'm going to give you one more example of an instance where an organization that we are working with decided that their entire North American market will be covered by manufacturing base in Europe. The other option was Asia, but they decided for either shipment cost and other reasons, they will do it only from Europe. So while they're exposed, if something were to happen to the European market, whether it be shipping or something like that, the way we protect them in some way is to say, can we forecast the demand and let the manufacturer plan according to, based on certain scenarios that otherwise would be unanticipated. So that's the kind of test that we are able to introduce and help the organization plan better.
Definitely. So I want to take Yassine's take on this as well. So we may have made policy mistakes in the past. We may have, our supply chains may have failed in the past. Is there any way to build a smart supply chain, a way to systematically learn from our mistakes in the past and failures in the past?
Well, I think we're human, right? So we all make mistakes, and we all make bad decisions from time to time. And you know, they say what separates the truly ultra successful people from the rest of us in the world is that they learn from their mistakes, they get back up, and they try again. But you know, from a supply chain and procurement and risk management perspective, that becomes really, really important. So having, again, going back to kind of the best practices, but using it in a learning way, having built into your process a constant introspective or analysis of what's working, what's not working, and not looking at a failure or a bad decision as a bad thing, but using it as a root cause analysis exercise where you're really focused on what went right, what went wrong, no finger pointing. Let's just learn from it. And then take that one step further and actually make it into an actionable item. So it's wonderful if you do all of this root cause analysis and you understand where things fell apart. But if you don't communicate that to the organization, and there was a lot of talk this morning about silos and supply chain not interacting with other parts of the organization. So that insight that you glean from the root cause analysis needs to be shared with cross-functional teams. So having a seat at the table, or you invite all the other folks to your table and bring in sales and marketing and finance and operations so that everyone in the organization that's responsible for making strategic decisions can hear what you've learned and what supply chain can do to fix that, or what supply chain can do to support strategic growth, or any of the other initiatives that are going on in the organization. So whether it's you getting a seat at the table or you invite the rest of the organization to your table, I think that's really how you learn from your process and continually, add to the system.
Thank you so much. So I guess you want to go ahead? Please?
Yeah, great point, Yasin. What I would like to add is everything she said, plus if organizations can invest in predictive analytics tools that can go beyond and answer questions, what if scenarios, I think that'll significantly
Fabulous
go.
point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just add one quick thing also? I think it's a great point what Yasin was saying but there's, to take it a step further, and this isn't necessarily risk related, but when you look at your supply base, your supply chain, how diverse is it? That's a big thing right now, right? How diverse is your supply base? Is it minority owned, women owned, veteran owned? That's a big thing right now. And obviously ESG indicators, right? So it's not just about risk within your supply chain, because there's certain things other than just pure risk. And, kind of just to piggyback on what you're saying, there's more to it.
Thank you so much. So in the interest of time, I guess I want to see if there's any question in the audience that our panelists could take. Anybody, any questions? You are one of my newest students. If you ask a good question, you get extra credit.
It's Friday after lunch. I mean, So.
Brave soul.
I guess the role of AI in detecting risk in supply chains.
I can take a first stab. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we all already operate with machine learning, right, within our predictive models. When you're talking about the amount of data that needs to be processed in order to cover, in many of these cases, I don't want to quote DNB's number, but you guys are at like 300 million, credit safe
600
around there. We cover about 30 million businesses worldwide, but have predictive analytics on about 10 million.
500 million.
500 million. Okay, so blowing us out. But the whole point of this is there's no ability to do that without machine learning compute. I think as the industry evolves, using LLM models is going to be a really key point for getting through decision making and kind of scenario testing, because that's a really great way to run those tabletops that we've been talking about and kind of get into where maybe some of your risks are. I think the other thing that's really interesting with that, and it's starting to kind of come out now, is actually AI tier mapping, basically by looking at who tends to work with different industries and different locations within a particular supply chain. And so we can't necessarily tell you 100% who is your tier 2 or your tier 3, but we can make suggestions about who they likely are. And obviously in your case, you guys with buyer power can oftentimes compel those tier ones as part of contracting to turn over that information. That tends to be something that works for people like, Alvin, where you've got a lot of buyer power. Smaller businesses have trouble with that, but if you can compel financial statements, that's your best bet.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to what Mike was saying is, our data cloud has 600 million businesses worldwide. It's updated 10 million times a day. So machine learning has been going on for a long time within all of our databases, not just TMB, right? So it's how are we adapting to that? How is that being put into our algorithms? And, listen, we've been around for 184 years. So the building out that AI process and the teams and the data science, it takes time, but I think all of us have adapted, and machine learning is part of every score we put out to our customer, every predictive indicator that we have, just like everybody else up here, right? And it's just getting more and more advanced. Obviously, I'm not breaking any news there. So,
As a consumer and user of, information to manage the supply chain, I'll tell you that the landscape as it was 5 years ago is different. 10 years ago, it's night and day. I mean, we implemented APIs where before we had analysts that had to actually go in, run a credit report, run a business intelligence report, download a financial statement. Now it's through an API, it's downloaded. We use, automation, which is part of the API AI stuff, to populate. And again, I'm going to use ratios again, right? So that we can understand that risk. We're not spending time, running anything. It's a direct feed, right? AI is doing everything for us, or automation, and it only spits out the red flags that we need to look at. So if you think about, I'm giving an example, my team, we're looking at key 30,000 vendors globally for Nestle. I only have 7 analysts doing this. And guess what? We can go through about 10,000 of these vendors every year. And about 3,000 of them are public or companies with public debt, right? Abundant financial information. Some of the companies are private, or most of the ones that are left, obviously. But they're in countries where financial information is readily available. Others, we need to reach out and get it. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the machine's doing most of the crunching for us. We're only looking at the results. And then what we do also is we benchmark, right? Again, different areas, different accounting standards, different times when that financial data was pulled and it translated into a different currency at a different time, it has an impact. We're comparing it. We're not doing it manually. We're using the machine to do that. Does that address your question?
he said yes.
Do you have time for more questions? All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, the audience, and thank you so much for the panelists.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, we could talk about risk all day long.